Hi, my name is Elaine Holden, and thank you for joining me today. Welcome to Education Matters here on Channel 96, Nashua, New Hampshire. I'm very glad you joined me today. As you can tell by the title, I'm going to be talking about IQ testing and toys, and those two don't seem to go together all that easily, but I assure you they do. Why am I talking about that? Well, because there are probably a dozen well-known IQ tests in the field, and I happen to be an evaluator. Back in the 1970s, when I was in a doctoral program in a Massachusetts university, I trained to become what's called a psychometrist. It's someone who does evaluations, who tests people, mostly children. Here in New Hampshire, many years later, I took the program of specialist in the assessment of intellectual functioning. And I actually sit on the board of the Association of Specialists in the Assessment of Intellectual Functioning. So I do a lot with testing. I try very hard, however, not to put a lot of energy and effort into IQ testing. In other words, I'll use pretty much any other test that I can do except an IQ test. I'm not really a believer in IQ tests. And I'm not the only one, although I will tell you that most school districts rely heavily on IQ testing, especially when children are being considered for special education. So what is an IQ test? Well, frankly, it's an achievement test, or it can be considered an achievement test in many respects. And when you look at how we test children for special education, what's interesting is that we test them with an IQ test and with at least one achievement test. We're not supposed to use just one test to determine if a child has special needs. You have to use two or more. Now, in my business, I talk a lot about diagnostic testing. I really don't do very much with achievement testing, but you're going to see a lot of school districts focusing on achievement testing and IQ testing. There are some people in the field that will be very clear. They think an IQ test is a type of achievement test. And you know what? It can be. And that's why we have to be extremely careful with IQ tests. The most common test, the one that's considered sort of the gold standard in the business, is the Wechsler test. We have the WHIPSI, which is the little children's test. We have the WHISC, which is the one that's generally given to most children in schools, at the school age. And then later on, when the 17 or 18-year-olds come along, we have the adult version, which is called the WAIS. Those three Wechsler tests are considered the gold standard for how you measure somebody's IQ. Another test, of course, is called the Stanford-Binet. It's older than the Wechsler. And the Stanford-Binet has a good reputation in the field. There are others. There's a C-TONI, comprehensive test of nonverbal intelligence. There's a DAS. There's the RIAS. We have lots. We have the Slauson. I could go on. Bottom line is, it's a series of fairly small subtests all pulled together to give what is called G, or general intelligence. And there are specialists in the field that do nothing but write big books about IQ testing. But let's look for a moment at the IQ test itself. And it's usually a series of perhaps 10 to 12 subtests. As I said, there are a bunch of smaller subtests. And it's broken up. About half would be what's called performance, and the other half would be called verbal abilities. And there's some tests on speed, coding, that sort of thing, working memory, etc. And now I want to talk a little bit about toys, because what do toys have to do with IQ tests? Well, interestingly enough, toys actually contribute a lot to IQ testing. People don't want to admit it in the business, but it in fact does happen. My uncle was one of the owners of a very large toy company. And toy companies spend a lot of time doing research and development, They spend a lot of time doing marketing research. They spend a lot of time trying to find the newest and the brightest and the best for that holiday season. And we've got a holiday season coming up. We've got Christmas, Kwanzaa, Hanukkah. We've got a time of the year when children, especially, are looking for great presents and terrific toys. And parents are out on the quest. They're checking out the best toys. They're looking for the most appealing toys. They're looking for the current toy, right? Okay, so for the year, you have huge teams in these big toy companies that check out the packaging of all of the other toys in the business. So there would be, for example, a doll, a new doll, and that doll would be evaluated for the packaging it came in, for its size, for its playability, for how well it markets. An examination would be of the target. Who are you targeting for this doll? What kind of a child? Would it go mostly to girls, upper class, middle class, lower class? Who's going to buy this doll? Who's going to want this doll? And these are the sorts of things that are evaluated constantly. And so now that we've got this doll or this toy airplane or whatever, you now have a big push for marketing. But there's another section of a toy company that people don't really pay too much attention to. And yet there are toy companies, and I'm not going to mention any names, I don't want to get sued, but there are toy companies that are quite big and quite actually profitable, and they have a division of psychologists who examine the testing that is being done in schools, in clinics, in hospitals, the IQ testing that is done on children. So, for example, the Wechsler, we call it the Whisk. We have the Whipsy, the Whisk, and the Waze. The Whisk and the Whipsy are usually the ones that are focused on. They buy the newest copy, and then they examine all of the items on that test. So when you develop a test, and I worked for the Stanford group for years and the Psychological Corporation, doing test development, as a matter of fact, writing the items for the test banks and helping with the field testing. And one of the things we do is we field test every single item. We're really, really careful about this because this is, multi-million dollars. You're looking at a test that will make a publishing company a lot of money. And so each item is very carefully crafted. Once those items are crafted and they're field tested and they're packaged into the test and sold, people from all types of professions that are interested in this can access it with the right, certain certifications. And usually, a psychologist will be able to purchase this if they're working for a company. So the toy company buys this IQ test. They take it apart, they evaluate it. For example, one of the performance tests requires a child to put pieces of a puzzle together and make something, whether it would be an elephant or a kangaroo or perhaps a little car. It's like a cardboard set of pieces, and there are big pieces with few numbers in order to make something, and there's some that's more intricate, and you kind of work your way up as far as how intricate can the puzzle be and have the child still put it together under a timed situation. So you've got your stopwatch and you're testing the child putting this puzzle together. Okay. So if a child has a sort of an understanding of how puzzles go together, that child has had prior experience. That child has a background knowledge of puzzles, of how puzzles go together, and interestingly enough, the shapes of certain animals and objects, and the shapes and the knowledge and the ability to language label those shapes gives this child sort of a heads up as to what he or she is doing. So if you have that kind of a heads up, you're more than likely to be able to accomplish this task easily and within the time frames. So just imagine toy companies that examine all of these puzzles. Now, you cannot make a puzzle that looks identical to a question on an IQ test. You cannot do that. That's a violation of copyright. But you can certainly design a puzzle that does the same thing, that has a similar number of pieces, that goes from a silhouette rather than a square, and allows the child to language label what is being done, what they're putting together. So if I'm putting together a kangaroo, and I have kangaroo pieces, and I know what a kangaroo is, and I can put all those pieces together, and then we have a little contest of let's see how fast we can do it. That child has had that background knowledge, that prior experience, and that lets the child get a heads up or a leg up on all of those other kids who have not had that advantage. And that's the thing that we have to remember. These children who have access to these toys and have parents who spend a lot of time with them, working them through those puzzles, showing them how it's done, giving them the opportunity to put those puzzles together, really help that child with that portion of the IQ test, which is now not testing so much that child's innate ability to put a puzzle together to figure it out, but in fact it now becomes an achievement test. How fast can they do something that they have had a similar experience to a lot? And now think of those blocks that we play with. And we put pictures together with blocks, you know, those shapes. Now there's a piece of the IQ testing that has red blocks, white blocks, and red and white. So it's kind of in a diamond pattern. And you put those pieces together to make a picture. You give a child an exposure to the picture, and then they look at the blocks and they put their blocks together to make the same picture. Again, it's a timed activity. But think of those kids who have had that exposure, who've had similar blocks. Now, obviously, they're not going to be red and white blocks. They're going to be green and blue or something else. They're going to be a different size. But it's going to be essentially the same task in a game format. It's a toy, and they're playing with this toy. And they have parents that work with them, and they may have tutors that work with them, showing them how to do it, showing them the pictures they can make. And they work with this little game, this little toy, and guess what? When they give that test to the child, when the evaluator, whether it's a psychometrist or a safe cert or whomever, or a psychologist gives that test to the child, is this an IQ test or is this yet again an achievement test? Now think of the publishers. Think of the publishers who put together those really cute picture book, activity book kinds of things. And think of the publishers who have sections in that book where you look at a picture and find what's missing. There's a section on the test that shows a child a picture. It says, what's missing here? If that child knows what that item is, and that child knows what that item should have in its entirety, that child can most likely, quite easily, find out what's missing. They look at it and they can pick it out pretty quickly. So if they have had experience with these toys, these games, these books that ask them to find what's missing, this is no longer a unique and special activity that's an IQ test. This is, in fact, once again, an achievement test. And then you start asking questions. And there's other parts of that test with the child. It's the verbal part of the test where you ask a question. For example, and I'll just take it off the top of my head, what on earth do we do with stamps? Now, years ago, school children used to take field trips to the post office. Used to walk around the post office and see how the mail was sorted and meet the postal carriers and watch things going on at the front desk. And stamps were explained. And remember, stamps used to be a real big deal for collection. Kids used to collect stamps, and they used to have big maps in their room. And they'd put a little pin in each country where they had a stamp that they got from that country, or a stamp about that country. And so the stamp collecting was a big deal. And it probably still is for some kids, not as big as it used to be. But you have stamp collecting, you have maps, you have a recognition of places all over the world that do stamps, and pretty much every country does. And so now somebody, usually a teacher, tells a child, this is why we have stamps. But then you have moms and dads who write Christmas cards, write thank you notes for the presents they got for Christmas and birthdays and everything else. Take the kids to the post office. The child and the parent buy the stamps together. The parent, and maybe the child, puts the stamps on the envelopes. And then the parent explains why you need stamps. So if the child has had a field trip with the teacher, and the child has been all over the post office, and the child watches mom or dad or both parents write thank you notes and write Christmas cards, in those days when people used to write letters a lot, and then the child goes with the parent to buy the stamps and puts the stamps on the envelope and repeatedly gets an explanation as to why we use stamps. If somebody doing an IQ test says, why do you need stamps? What's the purpose of stamps? The child who's had the field trips and the exposure and the direct instruction from the parents about what goes on in their world can most easily answer that question. But just imagine a child who has never been to the post office, and we know kids like that. Just imagine a child whose parents don't write letters, who don't send Christmas cards or Kwanzaa cards or any other kind of card, whose parents really don't deal a lot with mail other than the junk mail that comes and it goes in the trash, and you don't really have postage stamps on that. But think of the child that has had nothing to do really with the post office. But this child is not unintelligent. This child simply has not had that exposure. Yet if you have a question about what do you do with stamps and what's the importance of stamps, you now have a child that's at a disadvantage. Is this disadvantaged child less intelligent than the child who has had the field trip and the experience of buying stamps with the parents, and the experience of putting stamps on a letter, and the experience of mailing the letters and being told repeatedly why we use stamps? This then is not an intelligence test. This is a test of having been around the block a couple times at the post office. This is an experience test. This is a test of really one's culture, one's economic level, one's opportunities to have parents who spend a lot of time talking to them, and probably going to a school that can afford field trips. And that starts the whole thing off. Speaking of field trips, what's interesting that I'm really excited about is when I see the parents doing the pre-teaching on the field trips. Kids that will go to a museum for a certain display of something that will get a follow-up 1, 2, even 3 times to see the same thing again, not with their classmates, but with their families, so that they have that interactive experience. They get a better world view of things. You can even go beforehand if you know that there's going to be a field trip there and sort of pre-teach it, so they gain more when they go with their class. In any case, these world experiences, these opportunities to really get around and see things, now feed into a child's general knowledge, but also, if you know what those tests are going to ask, you can front load for that purpose as well. And publishers understand this, and publishers have books that discuss all of these different aspects of that test. So when you're looking at world experience and you're asking questions such as, what do you do with a stamp? If you have a savvy parent, or you have a parent group, or the parents actually know what's going on with these tests and are sort of linked in to the different newsletters that come from the publishers of children's materials, you're going to see a direct correlation between what the parents buy and expose the children to and what's on those IQ tests. So we have games and activities and toys, and we have published materials that sometimes come pretty close. They kind of skirt the copyright laws. And the psychologists and the lawyers for these huge corporations understand this. They're very good at what they do. But the bottom line is that knowledgeable parents expose their children very early and very often to those games and toys and published materials that go along with the IQ tests. So toys play a huge part in how well a child will do on an IQ test. Why is that important? Because some parents want to have their children labeled as gifted. There are special programs for gifted children. There are scholarships for gifted children. There's a lot of reasons that a parent would want their child to have as good an IQ as possible in order to sort of pave the way for their educational experiences. And in so doing, they have really trained their children to pass those IQ tests. Those IQ tests then have become an achievement test. And when I say, people that have not had the same experience, but have the really same intellect or higher, now become at a disadvantage. And this is a serious issue because it's not just our current crop of children. It's not just the ones that we have in school today that I'm concerned about. I'm also concerned about the adult gifted that have been completely overlooked. Because what we're seeing nationwide is that many gifted adults, truly intelligent, and I mean highly intelligent individuals, have been mislabeled. Some of them have been mislabeled as borderline personality disorder, bipolar disorder, severely depressed, you name it, and they've been labeled with some kind of mental health issue, one type or another. How often does this happen? I don't have statistics on that. I just know that there are research findings. I don't have the numbers. The research findings that I have read about certainly indicate a mislabeling of adults. And so there are many adults who have bad feelings about themselves. They think maybe they're not very smart at all, that they're different, that they follow a different drummer, that there's something wrong with them. But the reality is, it's nothing wrong with them. They have been either mislabeled or somebody has failed to label them. They are thinking ahead of the pack. They're thinking thoughts that others of average or low average intelligence are not capable of thinking of. And instead of celebrating this intelligence, they have been, in fact, mislabeled as having something wrong with them. And these are the folks who have not had, as children, the advantage of those toys, those experiences, those practice sessions. And they may have been confronted with IQ tests that are totally confusing. My point is that IQ tests really may not be doing the job that we think they are. And to hang that much weight on an IQ test when we don't examine the child's background, we don't examine whether this child has literally been coached for the test, we don't inquire whether this child has had access to toys that specifically target those items on the test, if we don't inquire about that, we're not really doing our job as evaluators. I'm also saying right now that IQ tests are a type of achievement in many instances. Achievement tests are academic in origin. And supposedly, although it's not supposed to happen, what we're seeing is school districts looking at a discrepancy between the two, achievement and IQ. They're not supposed to. This discrepancy formula is a lot of hogwash. There's nothing in the federal regulations or laws that say that there has to be a numeric discrepancy. Numeric is never in there. Discrepancy is at the selection, really, of the school district, the school team. So it has to be a parent and a teacher and any number of other professionals. If they feel that the child is not working up to his or her potential, then most certainly there is a discrepancy there, and this child should receive specialized instruction, not necessarily be given a coding of learning disabled. This child should be getting specialized instruction under something called response to intervention, which is another show in its entirety. But the bottom line is that we're putting a lot of energy into looking at these IQ tests. We're putting a lot of belief that the IQ test is the end-all and be-all. We're looking at children with a lower IQ and saying, well, they don't have as much potential as, this other child over here. But that other child over there probably has parents buying the right toys and getting the right publications and providing the right instruction so that this child has the prior knowledge necessary to be able to encounter the items on those tests and do very, very nicely. So let's examine it very closely when we're looking at toys for our kids, when we're looking at buying toys for Christmas. What are you going to do? You're going to look at those toys and see what the educational value is, because this show is not going to stop people from doing IQ tests. This show, hopefully, however, will inform parents and grandparents as to what really is going on with some of these IQ tests and how people are getting around the IQ test to make their children look better than they really are because of that prior knowledge. So think about it, look it up, get some more information on it, and I think you'll be surprised because there's a lot of controversy in the field right now. And so I thank you very much for joining me today on Education Matters. I look forward to being with you again next week. This is Elaine Holden for Channel 96, Nashua, New Hampshire.